Shalom and Baruch Hashem, and greetings from Salt Lake City, Utah in the United States. I very much appreciate the opportunity in these difficult times to participate in this conference. I am a professor at the University of Utah School of Medicine. My specialization is developmental and related problems in children, as well as brain injuries. And for the last 40 years, I have directed a clinic in which we see between 500 and 600 children every year with all kinds of developmental and genetic and medical challenges that make growing up a challenge for them. Today, we're going to talk about a very specific topic, the differences that children present in their temperaments and a specific kind of temperament. And I'm not sure what the Hebrew is for temperament, but those qualities children bring to the world with them. And that temperament has to do with a slow development of self-discipline, or the ability to control and regulate one's behavior. We have a very short time together today. My understanding is that mine is the first talk. So I wanted to set a foundation so that we share an understanding of what do we mean by problems with self-discipline, what do we mean by this term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and 5 lessons that I would hope would give you some guidance in trying to help your children or your students when they in fact present with this kind of problem. I, for one, am not a big fan of pathologizing or demonizing or moralizing children. I prefer to describe the challenges they experience rather than to label them, which has become very popular. So we are going to talk about ADHD, but I will not discuss every symptom, every associated problem. Instead, I will offer an understanding of what do we mean by this? Why does this happen to children? I'm a neuropsychologist, and as a neuropsychologist, I'm not as interested in diagnostic labels, but rather I am most interested in understanding the processes that lead children to either be successful as they work through school and family and life, or a challenge and cause difficulty for them. Because this is a recorded presentation, I will not have the opportunity to respond to questions, but my website is on the screen. There's all kinds of articles there. I will tell you that I am the science consultant for Neurotech, an Israeli-based company, and we develop all kinds of tests and related e-products in assessing and working with children. So I come to Israel quite often and hope someday in the future to present live to you. My email is there, info@samgoldstein.com. And if you have a specific question, please write to me. If you write in Hebrew, I will do my best to translate it. I am a yeshiva bucha, but that was a very long time ago, and Hebrew is not something I speak on a regular basis. So let's begin. I can tell you that I receive no compensation for this talk. I have no agenda. I'm not trying to sell any products. I'm just trying to convey knowledge and information. So let me move my slides ahead here. The Bible, the Old Testament, I think is a book that was written to give us a guide in how to live our lives. Sometimes it's not an easy guide. And the stories that the Bible tells, the parables, are designed to teach us about ourselves and about our children. And the Bible, I think, takes a forgiving role for people who are impulsive or act without thinking. And in particular, one of my favorite stories is about Jacob and Esau and how different they were as children, how different they were in their abilities and how they learned in their personalities. And some have joked that Esau had ADHD because he liked to move around and he didn't develop good self-discipline, and he was tempted and impulsively behaved in ways that really weren't in his best interest. What do we know about these boys as they grew up? The Midrash tells us that Esau was like myrtle, Jacob was like myrtle, and Esau a wild rose growing side by side. Supposedly, Jacob gave off a pleasant aroma, and Esau one of thorns. And after many years of schooling, Jacob continued on And Esau was seduced by the temptations of life and worshipped idols and lived a life of supposed depravity. And later Jewish tradition favors Jacob, the studious, capable, avid learner, the student who makes any teacher feel like they are capable and competent, the child who makes any parent feel like they're the most perfect parent, the child who makes any sporting coach feel like they are the best. And then Esau, who's demonized, Esau, who likes to talk and move and question, the hunter, the man who needed to work with his hands and stayed on the move, didn't sit still very well. Esau's impulsiveness, his inability to sit still, mimics the symptoms of ADHD. ADHD is not a creation of North American scientists, for that matter. We can find in history many lessons of how impulsive behavior leads to problems. And so for me, when I examined the research, I was a brain researcher before 45 years ago. I decided I liked children better than rats, but I am still a scientist. And for me, the problem of ADHD is not an inability to pay attention. When the task is interesting and enjoyable, these children pay attention fine. It's when it's boring and repetitive and effortful and not of their interest, when they have to sit and can't move, that they have more trouble. It's an immaturity in developing self-discipline. And of course, the story goes that Isaac favored Esau, Rebekah favored her son, the scholar. And as parents and educators, we can't help but value Jacob's talents over Esau's. We're socialized into a culture that values book learning, that values sitting still, paying attention, and doing what your parent or your teacher tells you. And in some ways, we've pathologized those children who don't easily fit into our system. But not all children are like this. Not all children are verbal learners. Not all children sit still for long periods of time. Not all children act without impulse. I'm not going to suggest that impulsive people save the world or solve the world's problems, because more often than not, behaving without thinking leads you into trouble. But I am going to suggest that because this group of children in particular, those that are poorly self-disciplined, don't fit our expectations as parents and educators, as coaches, as other community providers, that they are in some ways less cherished and less valued, when in fact they probably have as much to offer the world as those children who from early ages sit still. Dan Siegel wrote a wonderful book called The Developing Mind. And Dr. Siegel, I'm going to see if I can move my images here so they're out of the way. That's better. Dr. Siegel wrote that we are caregivers. And as caregivers, we are architects. And we are architects in the way experience influences genetics. You can have all the genes to speak. If no one speaks to you, you won't talk. You could have all the genes to socialize. If no one gives you the opportunity to meet others, you won't know how to do it. You could have all the genes to live a holy and worthy life. But if models aren't provided, you don't do it. And so complex human behavior requires a push from the environment. And some children need a more patient, a more careful, a more thought out push than others. What is ADHD? If we go back, now let's see, where can I put these? Maybe over here again. Okay. If we go back in history, hundreds of years ago, there's writings of about children who were fidgety, who didn't sit still, who didn't listen. If we go back 120 or 30 years, there are case studies of impulsive children who seem to not learn from experience. And now we know that these children do, in fact, learn from experience, but in the heat of the moment have a difficult time doing what they know. So what is this condition that we define as a mental health disorder when in fact it really is a developmental delay? And I'm not sure why my slides are not. There we go. ADHD involves a certain part of the brain. It's a delay in maturation. I'm having trouble deciding where to put these pictures here. In part of the brain, we call that the brain's braking system, the front of the brain, the middle of the brain, and the back of the brain. It's the part of the brain that helps us stop and think, that opens a window between experience and response, that gets us to stop and consider our actions before we act. And I'm still having trouble. Okay, I'll have to use this on the screen here. There's a high rate of co-occurrence. Now, why is that the case? If we say, well, it's an immaturity in how the brain develops, if you pick any challenge, problems with self-discipline, problems with focused attention and restlessness are characteristic of those. So it's very easy to label any child who's having some trouble with self-discipline as having ADHD, but they typically don't. It's not all the case. And the symptoms of ADHD, impulsivity, inattentiveness, restless behavior, leads to all kinds of consequences. That is, if you leave your self-control home one day, you're going to have a difficult and challenging day. So it is a problem of immaturity, a problem of the rate at which parts of the brain myelinate and grow and lead to challenges in children behaving in ways that their peers behave. We talk about difficulty with inattention, and one of the things we know is that when they're motivated, these children pay attention as well as others, but in less motivating situations, it's hard for them to bring attention to the table, and they have a harder time with restless, impulsive, or non-thinking behavior. Believe it or not, more brain cells have to fire in the brain to sit still than to move. The human brain is programmed to keep us moving because, after all, up until just recently, you moved all day long. You looked for food. From the time we were cast out of the Garden of Eden, where food and sustenance and safety were provided, we spent our lives searching for a safe place to sleep, searching for clean water to drink or food to eat. And so it isn't surprising that the brain wants to keep us moving, and it isn't surprising that part of growing up is learning to slow down and stop moving. Clearly, this pattern of inattention finds its way across children and adults. And whether or not hyperactivity and impulsivity are one or two problems is unclear, but it's rare to find restless children who don't act without thinking, and it's rare to find children who act without thinking, who are impulsive, who aren't also quite restless. So what do we know? The immaturity in parts of the brain make it hard for children to use their experiences in the moment to guide their behavior to function better, to function more as expected. It is not a disease. It is not an illness. It is an immaturity. And it would be wonderful if we designed an educational system, if we designed a world in which we patiently develop that maturity, but we don't do it because the majority of children don't require it. And so children with poor self-discipline over time end up having quite a few problems because they can't meet the expectations we put in front of them. And neither the level of impairment or the life outcome for these individuals is predicted by the diagnosis, by the symptoms, or by the treatment. So what I'm telling you there is that the outcome of children who are inattentive or hyperactive or have poor self-discipline isn't predicted by their age of diagnosis, isn't predicted by the severity of their symptoms, isn't predicted by the number of medications or treatments they take. This is an important point because it helps us understand that your condition doesn't predict your life. So many other variables predict what happens to us in life. And the very same variables that predict life outcome for all children predict life outcome for impulsive or inattentive children. And over time, it is of interest to note that about a third of children with this problem grow up and fit into society fine. They may not always remember to do things. They may not always eat the best diet or make the best decisions, but well over a third fit into the world, and it isn't based on their treatment. It's based on their other assets and their other capabilities. Leave your self-discipline home one day and see what life is like. It's challenging. And that's why about a third of these children, when they grow up, based on other challenges in their lives, other issues that they confront, other problems they may have, really struggle. Self-discipline, regulating your behavior, focusing your attention, managing your impulses is critical no matter what kind of life problem you may be experiencing. And so what I'm telling you is that symptom relief is not enough to assure good outcome for adults with ADHD. And I see some kids who struggled with this, who as adults are doing fine. Some take medicine, some don't. I see others who did well as children because their lives were well managed by their family and teachers and sometimes a medication, but as adults, when left to make their own decisions, aren't doing well. My focus on the children I see in our clinic, this is the 40th year of our clinic here in Salt Lake City, so I've seen thousands and thousands of children. Our focus is on finding strengths. Our focus is on making sure that for every weakness, we find and develop two strengths in children. So it isn't surprising that the symptoms of ADHD, behaving impulsively, restless behavior, inattention, lead to all kinds of problems and all kinds of outcomes. Again, self-discipline is a critical component for children to negotiate school and family life, to spend hours in shul and pray and listen and communicate. It requires a high level of self-discipline. And when children struggle with this, they experience all kinds of risks and outcomes. So what I'm telling you is that this problem, this immaturity and self-discipline, which we now call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a catalyst. And by that I mean it is like putting gasoline on a fire. So if children have trouble learning to read and they have ADHD, it's even harder. If children have trouble learning to control their worry and they have ADHD, it's a greater struggle. If children have trouble with unhappiness and depression and also have ADHD, they push to deeper depths of depression. Again, self-regulation, self-discipline, stopping and paying attention to details, taking time to make good choices are critical variables for everyone, especially for those that struggle. So it isn't surprising that we find a high rate of co-occurring problems, depression, anxiety, learning disabilities in children who demonstrate symptoms of ADHD. It isn't surprising we find a high rate of this kind of a challenge in obesity, a high rate of this kind of a challenge, believe it or not, in children who end up being mistreated or abused. And I'm not blaming the child, but if you're living in a home with a parent who uses corporal punishment, strikes with a stick, this is the child that will get struck far more than their siblings. So it's a condition that reflects exaggeration of normal behavior. I'm a big fan of not pathologizing children's problems in an effort to help us understand what it is they need. What children with ADHD demonstrate in their behavior, whether it's not sitting still in school or rushing through their work or joking around in class or not being able to stay focused during religious services, all of that is exaggeration of normal behavior. These children are not schizophrenic. They're not psychotic. For the most part, they're always in the moment. They have a hard time thinking about what just happened and using it to guide their behavior with an eye towards the future. They're always here. They don't travel through time in their heads very well. We are the only species, God graced us with the ability to travel through time. How do we do that? The word in English is chronesthesia. It means traveling through time in your head. You can think of where you were this morning. You can think of where you will be this evening. And your mind allows you to travel through time. Children with ADHD don't do that very well. They're always in the moment. So therefore, they're repeat offenders. They make the same mistakes over and over, not because they don't know, but because they don't stop and take advantage of the knowledge they possess. The core problem is self-discipline, in stopping, waiting. For these children, it's on the mind, out the mouth. The front of the brain gets information a little bit later than the middle of the brain from the outside world, a few milliseconds later. And children are born with the middle of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, in charge, which is why they cry and get upset so easily. And as they mature and grow, as the front of the brain myelinates, meaning it develops and matures, we develop the ability to stop and think about what's happening and respond by thinking, or respond through thought, not just through emotion. That's part of growing up. And that shift is what children with ADHD have so much trouble doing. Self-discipline lets us separate thought from feeling, experience from response. It lets us consider an experience, change our perspective, think differently about something. This group of children are very rigid. When they see one way of doing it, it's very hard for them to see another way of doing it. It allows us to think of alternative responses. It allows us to choose a response so we don't just act on the first thing we think of. It allows us to change a response if in fact our first response isn't effective. And this group of children tend to see one way of doing it. And even after you point out to them that the way they're doing it isn't going to work, they still insist that this is the way they're going to do it. And it's not because they're strong-willed or resistant to guidance. It's really because they can't focus on more than one alternative at a time. This group of children doesn't negotiate life very effectively in an automatic way. Think about driving. Green is go, red is stop. You drive without thinking, but you always have an extra set of driving behaviors for special occasions. If you hear a siren, even if the light is green, you drive differently. You stop and think about what's happening and choose a different response. This is what the human brain can do. We can respond to the environment, sometimes without even thinking. And in video game playing, this group of children will play as long as everybody else, but they tend to be repeat offenders, meaning they make the same mistakes again and again before they learn. They don't track cues. A cue is something in the environment, like the traffic light, that tells you you need to do something. A cue is the siren on the fire engine, and that cue tells you don't pay attention to the green light cue. This is complex behavior, and children have to learn how to do this, and some children are just slower, and slow often isn't fast enough. So children with poor self-discipline aren't clueless. It doesn't mean they don't know what to do. It means they don't do what they know. They are cueless. So you don't want to pull over when the fire engine is 5 blocks away. You don't want to pull over when the fire engine is just approaching. You want to pull over when the fire engine is in the right spot. You don't want them honking their horn on your bumper. These children miss cues. You send them to their room to get their shoes, and they come back with something else. And you ask, what did I send you to the room to retrieve, to get? And the child will respond, my shoes. And then you ask, why didn't you get them? And the child responds, I forgot. He didn't forget the shoes. He forgot the cue. Think about the last time you entered a room and you couldn't remember why you went in there. What did you do? You looked around. Why am I here? This group of children has trouble with cues. They don't self-cue. And researchers are finding a lot of success in teaching them how to scan the environment, how to track cues, how to use electronic devices as reminders, and finding that it is effective. They don't have that automatic system that enables them to do that. So poor self-discipline leads to poor self-control. Running around when you're supposed to be sitting still. Poor self-discipline leads to impulsive behavior, acting without thinking. Now, I need you to consider that these children are doing the best they can. It is not because they are defiant or resistant or unwilling or can't learn. It is because there's a difference between knowing what to do and doing what you know. Those are not the same. And for some of us, the gap between knowing what to do and doing what we know is quite large. Consider for a moment if you had epilepsy. You know that having a seizure is not a good thing, and yet you can't stop or control that seizure. I'm not suggesting that these children have a disease or a disorder, but rather, again, an immaturity in the rate at which the front of the brain is developing to allow them to stop and think and regulate and control their behavior. And when does this problem show itself? Not when it's interesting or enjoyable, because in our research, we've demonstrated that children with ADHD pay attention just fine if the task is interesting to them. They will play their video game. They will engage in whatever it is they enjoy, whether it's skateboarding or any other activity, if they like it, if they enjoy it, if they choose it. But when you need self-discipline is when the task is repetitious, repetitive, when it's effortful, when it's uninteresting, when it's not of your choosing. Supposing you worked for me and I said, we now have a job to do that's repetitive, effortful, uninteresting, and none of you would choose to do it if given the opportunity. Who likes that job? Nobody would volunteer. But if you needed to do it, you would bring self-discipline online and you would engage in the activity. You would drive yourself to do it even though there wasn't a payoff. And when do we see this problem in terms of consequences, meaning rewards and punishments? When the payoff is delayed, when it's infrequent, when it's unpredictable, when it lacks meaning. No one likes boring, repetitive, effortful, uninteresting activities that have delayed, infrequent, unpredictable payoffs. So these children are just like the rest of us, but the rest of us can bring online sufficient self-discipline when needed. And when we do that, then we can engage in the boring school assignment. When we do that, we can engage in the task our mother asks us to do in cleaning our room. It requires that kind of self-discipline. So when these children have the most trouble is when the task isn't of their interest, when it's repetitive, when it's not of their choosing, when the payoff is delayed. And it's like the rest of us, but they have a hard time bringing the self-discipline to the table that's needed. In the remaining few moments, there are a lot of things we could talk about, and I'm assuming that other speakers are going to spend more time perhaps on the diagnostic symptoms of this problem, or perhaps a little bit more on assessment or evaluation. The instruments that I'm helping Neurotech develop are designed to look at how children pay attention to boring, repetitive tasks, how they regulate their impulses, how they proceed through the task in a disciplined way. These are not tests for ADHD, but rather they measure abilities that children with ADHD have trouble with. But they don't diagnose. The diagnosis has to be based in the eyes of a clinician with a careful assessment of history, because again, inattentive, restless, impulsive behaviors are the most common kinds of problems children have. And sometimes they're just caused by lack of discipline. And sometimes they're caused by emotional difficulty or learning disabilities, or one has to take the time to carefully evaluate. Otherwise, every other child looks like they have ADHD. And the other thing I'll tell you just before we talk about these 5 lessons very quickly is that stimulants, the medicines that we use to treat this condition, help everyone pay attention better. This is unlike other medicines. So if you're not depressed, an antidepressant doesn't make you happier. And if you're not anxious, an anxiety medicine doesn't make you calmer. If you're not schizophrenic, an antipsychotic medicine doesn't give you a better grasp on reality. But you can tell me you have no trouble paying attention, and a stimulant like Ritalin, methylphenidate, dextroamphetamine will help you pay attention better. We can't use the medicine as a probe to prove the condition. Otherwise, nearly everyone would say, I must have ADHD because when I drink a cup of coffee, when I consume a caffeinated drink, when I take a stimulant, I function better. Everyone functions better. The brains of these children are not backwards. They're not disorganized. They're just like everyone else's brain. They're just maturing slower in those parts of the brain that help us with self-discipline and self-guidance. And remember what I told you earlier, that treatment is good for symptom relief, and symptom relief is valuable, but we have not found for ADHD that symptom relief contributes significantly into adult life. So children who take medicine don't necessarily grow up to do better than children who didn't. And children who are in special education don't necessarily grow up to do better than children who weren't. It's a complicated process, and the qualities that contribute to good life outcome for all children contribute to good life outcome for children with ADHD. So here are my 5 lessons very quickly. I apologize that I'm going through them very, very fast, and I hope someday in the future to have the opportunity to spend more time with you. Those of you that are comfortable understanding my rather quick New York style and accent. I grew up in Brighton Beach and then came to Salt Lake in 1977 to finish my doctoral research. Some of you may be aware, this is the center of the LDS, the Mormon community. The Mormons consider themselves one of the lost tribes of Israel. I joke sometimes that they really got lost and ended up in Salt Lake City. So lesson 1, don't pathologize, demonize, or moralize these children. The fact of the matter is they're really not very different from others. Their difference occurs when they have to bring self-discipline online. And this group of children does best when they can talk and move and question. Talk and move and question. This is a framework for a number of classroom designs and research that I've been involved with, in which children with ADHD actually function quite well because they can talk and move and question. It's an interesting framework, I think. And I would urge you to consider that difference is not bad. Again, not pathology. And I would urge you to consider words and choose words that are descriptive in a positive or neutral rather than a negative way. I can call someone slow, and someone else can call the behavior of that same person as careful. And those differences make a very big difference in how that child will respond to what I say or want to do with them. Let me go on to lesson 2 here. I apologize, my slides are not changing. I think you have to adopt a learning to ride a bicycle mindset. And by that I mean when we're teaching children to ride a bicycle or to swim or to engage in any activity, some children get it right away. And we as parents and teachers think we're wonderful educators. And some children take longer. And when children are learning to ride a bicycle, we are all very patient. And when the child struggles or is fearful, most of us are patient and keep putting them on that bicycle. And we tell them that slow is fast enough, you'll eventually learn to do it. I think we need to do that with this group of children. The dilemma is it's high stakes. It's not riding the bicycle. It's staying in the yeshiva. It's learning your haftarah. It's applying yourself in situations that are maybe not of your choosing, that are going to take you a longer time to master. And somehow we have to find ways to do it. And I'm not one to advocate giving large rewards, doing things that are out of the ordinary, providing extraordinary payoffs for doing these things, because then children will just want more and more. Sure, I think a payoff for working hard is valuable, but the real payoff comes from the inside, the feeling and the knowledge that you've accomplished something. Lesson, well, this is part of that lesson. When we make the work interesting, the discipline takes care of itself. That was E.B. White. E.B. White, among others, wrote a book called Charlotte's Web. a very popular children's book. And you'll find that when the work is more interesting, the discipline takes care of itself. And if you're working with children with this problem, I would encourage you in a classroom, find something they enjoy, find something they like, put them in charge of it, and see how well it transitions or it helps in other areas of their lives. Lesson 3, why do we intervene? What are we trying to do? We don't want children to lose hope. We want them to feel empowered. I had a child tell me once that God gave him half a brain and there was nothing he could do about it. And when I asked him, how did he know there was nothing he could do about it? Because I wasn't going to argue about did he or didn't he have a half a brain. He told me his teacher told him that he would never amount to anything. So even when we're frustrated, I think we have to resist comments that lead our children to believe we've given up on them. I think we have to provide education. And the children we work with, we teach them about what does it mean to pay attention and what does it mean to think before you act. And we try different strategies. We try different games or other kinds of activities to help them understand what we mean. We try and reframe, as I pointed out. I've had children who will tell me that, my teacher says I don't pay attention, and we spend some time talking about the fact that the child is paying attention, just not to what the teacher wants them to pay attention to. So it isn't that you can't pay attention, it's that you have to learn to pay attention to the things that are important in the adults around you. And for me, the most critical issue is the child's self-acceptance and self-esteem. If children eventually believe they're worthless, then nothing we do will make a difference for them. And some children need more time to develop self-discipline. Some children get it right away. And in their first year of yeshiva, they sit and they focus and they work, and no matter how long you ask them to study, they continue to study. And others are born to move, and they can't stay for long periods. And if you force them to do it right out of the gate, right at the start, you force them to do something they can't do, it'll never work. I'm not suggesting that you give up, but that you start where the child can function successfully and work forward from there. A couple of more things. I think children need to believe that we, as their parents and educators, yes, we are the authority, but we are a partnership with them. Doing what we ask, acquiring knowledge, managing your behavior isn't something you do because we make you. It's something we do because we're partners and you want to do it. I think we help children set realistic goals. We rewrite negative scripts. A negative script is something negative that we say to the child that really doesn't get us anywhere, such as, how many times are you going to do that? Or, how many times do I have to remind you? In some research studies, children with ADHD require 8 to 10 times as many reminders and guidance to develop basic habit behavior. Meaning, if it takes a child a week or 2 weeks to remember to flush the toilet, it could take this child up to 20 weeks. And we get tired after a while. How many times do I have to show you? But some children need many more repetitions before they can do it. And focus on strengths. As I pointed out, in studies of those children who are resilient, who over time succeed and overcome obstacles, it is because they harness their strengths. And the more liabilities you have, the more strengths you need. And it's important to remember that pills don't make for skills. And learning to manage your behavior, understanding who you are as a person, doesn't come in a pill. And I would never ask a child who is struggling, did you take your pill today? Because it externalizes control. It makes the child believe that some external source, the pill, controls them, when in fact, it is not the case. And we talk about building resilience, and we can discuss this perhaps in a future talk, those kinds of qualities, empathy, communication, problem solving, that help you deal with stress and adversity in difficult times. Lesson 4, focus on well-being. This is the model set up 20 years ago at Tufts University by Lerner and his colleagues. Believe it or not, there are a lot of us Jews in this field, particularly in child development. And this is Lerner's model. I think it works well in classroom settings. It works well in families. We want to help children be competent. We want them to be confident. I don't want you to develop self-control and be miserable. I want you to be connected to people. I want you to develop positive values and integrity and live a decent life, whatever that life is, whether you choose to live by one set of values or another. And I want you to be caring and compassionate towards others. I think this is a very good framework for a classroom educator to help parents understand what is it we're trying to accomplish in the children we work with. And finally, practice forgiveness. My teaching taught me that God can't forgive my sins towards others. And if I sin, I can't turn to God, and I apologize if I'm using the term, maybe I should use the term Hashem. I can't turn to Hashem and make amends to people for me. I have to do it myself. And just as Hashem cannot punish by proxy, he can't forgive by proxy. It is up to us to forgive our children when they don't meet our expectations. Children with ADHD did not choose this path. This is in their genes. I am not a biological determinist. I don't think that biology determines what happens to us, but it does affect probability. And there are plenty of children who struggle with this pattern of behavior, who as adults are living very normal lives. As I pointed out, they don't always pay attention. They don't always make the best decisions, but they fit into the world. If we alienate a group of children because at a younger age their self-discipline is poor, their choices are not always good, how can they ever in the future live a normal life? So what do we know about Jacob and Esau? Maybe I shouldn't dichotomize. We have lots of other children. We have them in our families, in our congregations. We have them in our yeshivas. We have to provide experiences for them, just as we have children who are emotional, who worry, children who struggle to socialize, children who become overwhelmed and feel helpless and anxious, even over minor stresses. Every child's way of engaging the world is no less relevant to his or her spiritual development than any other. Sometimes I joke that if it wasn't for the Esau's of the world, the Jacobs of the world would still be sitting in a cave shivering, because it was the Esau's who went out and learned ways of making fire and learned ways of hunting and creating sustenance for us. Society, as I started, may value one over the other today, but they're both most important. And so I think as educators and parents, we have to possess the wisdom to value our children's differences, to show our fairness in meeting each child's individual needs, to not start with an a priori list of this is what makes a perfect child, but rather start with this is the child we have, let's see how we can help make them perfect. There is my website. There's all kinds of articles and other webinars. You can email me questions. I will not capture your name or solicit you. I do send out an article periodically, sometimes once a month, every other month. You can be on my mailing list. I was scheduled to speak at a yearly ADHD conference in Tel Aviv this November, which of course is not going to take place, but I look forward to coming to the Holy Land for a visit next year, and I look forward sometime in the future to meeting all of you. There's my email, my website. I have a Twitter and a Facebook if you're someone who follows those things, and a YouTube talk. I did a TED talk that I did 6 years ago on this clinic and what I've learned from the children I work with. So I'd like to thank you all for your time. I hope this was informative. There are all kinds of articles on my website. A copy of these slides has been made available to the officiators of this conference, and they can certainly make them available to you. So I wish you all well, Baruch Hashem, in this very difficult and challenging time. But as we note, time sometimes seems to go by slowly, but eventually it takes us to a better place. And we Jews well know that in the darkest of times, there's always the brightest of times that comes after. So thank you very much.